Buongiorno tutti. Welcome back. A couple of quick announcements. This evening will be the social dinner, and tickets are sold out, I believe. But for those of you who have a ticket, the bus will be leaving at 7 o'clock this evening in front of this building. It's going to be in a castle. It's a little chilly sometimes in the castle. There's no heat. So they recommend to dress like an onion, I've been told, which I'm assuming means have layers. And no high heels, they recommend. So, Alfonso, take note. So our first speaker this morning is Michael Beauchamp, and without further ado, we'll get started.
Thanks, Brad. Can you hear me all right in the back? Mic is working excellent. I can put this in my pocket then. And thanks to Marius and all the organizers. It's such a wonderful, very stimulating conference and such a beautiful location. And special thanks to Alex Martin, of course, who started me out on my multi-sensory journey. When I joined his lab as a postdoc, I guess it was 15 years ago now, he sat me down. He said, Michael, enough with the pictures, enough with the videos. Why don't you play some sounds? And I said, okay, let's do it. So here we are. I've recently moved to Baylor College of Medicine, as some of you might know, and it's been a lot of fun. We're growing pretty rapidly, and I'm a bunch of new faculty who do systems neuroscience research, and I'm very excited about our newest hire. Some of you might know Tatiana Schnur, who starts with us on July 1st. So come and visit Houston if you're ever on that side of the world. So today I'm going to tell you about multisensory speech perception. If I can get my pointer to go here. And this is face-to-face speech, which is the original form of human communication. It begins early. It's critical for normal human development. Tatiana just had a beautiful new baby, Sophia, so I was holding Sophia the other day. And when you hold a baby, you naturally use infant-directed speech. So you talk slowly, you exaggerate your mouth movements, so the baby can learn that correspondence between the speech sounds that you're making and the mouth movements that go along with them. So today I'm going to sort of provide a general overview of where we're at in understanding multisensory speech perception. The first part is going to be behavior, and I'm going to talk a lot about the McGurk effect. It's not our only measure of multisensory speech perception, but it's the 40th anniversary of the McGurk effect this year, so I figure I'll focus my talk around that. Then the second part of the talk will be about models of speech perception, and the third part will be neural mechanisms of speech perception. Each one's about 15 minutes, so should be plenty of time for discussion. So this is the illusion. I'm sure all of you have heard of it, but just to review it, you have an auditory ba and a visual ga. Here's a picture of Harry McGurk. And if you put those together, you don't hear either ba or ga. What you perceive is da. We call that the McGurk or fusion percept. And for all of the students, trainees out there, it's important. This is another example of a serendipitous discovery. What happened was they were studying infant speech perception. They wanted to know when children could see the difference or notice the difference if auditory and visual cues didn't match. So this was the days of film. They took films of an actor saying ba and ga, sent them off to the lab and said, can you take the audio and put it together with the visual? It came back from the lab. Harry is an irascible Scotsman, and he watched the video. He said, da, fucking da, I didn't ask for da. But they didn't just throw the tape in the garbage. They went back and turned the sound down, and it was ba, and watched the video, and it was ga. So the lab had done exactly what they were told. But when you put those incongruent speech stimuli together, you get da. And that was their paper, basically, just saying, hey, look at this. So, and because it's the 40th anniversary, I'll just spend a minute talking about the history of the McGurk effect. There was a nice paper last year in PNAS by some computer scientists, and they talk about this phenomenon of sleeping beauties. So these are papers that are basically ignored for decades, and then all of a sudden they're noticed. And there was a famous paper by Einstein, Podolsky, Rosen in the 30s. Basically, people knew it was there, but they didn't really understand it or what. But 60 years later, it started getting cited 1,000 times. So it took that long for it to be noticed. And the McGurk paper is a little bit like that. This shows the annual citations, not total citations, but how much it was cited per year. And you can see after the publication, 0, right? It came out, not a trace. It dropped without a sound. So you're like, oh, crap. But then 20 years later, people started noticing it, and now it's cited hundreds of times a year. So don't be discouraged if your paper gets ignored. Maybe it's just a Sleeping Beauty. And of course, an obvious question is, that's what I tell myself every morning. What caused this awakening, and we don't really know. Obviously, the Stein and Meredith book played a big part in awakening interest in multisensory integration. There's AVSP conferences, Multisensory Research Forum, but it's kind of a mystery. But it's an interesting phenomenon. This is not that rare, actually, in science. Okay, so here's the phenomenon. I'm going to actually play you a few examples because what's the point without videos? And I'm going to show you a video of Harry doing his eponymous illusion. Sounds like a band name. Harry and the eponymous illusion. Okay, and I just want to emphasize that is Harry doing the illusion, but the original stimuli that were used in the study are lost. They threw out the tapes after they did the study, or let's get more complicated than that. But so anyone who wants to do this kind of study has to make their own stimuli. You can download them from YouTube. So I'll just unpack the illusion. Here's a video from YouTube of someone demonstrating the illusion. I just blocked the mouth so you can focus on the sound.
Ba 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 ba. Ba, ba.
So that's a recording of this bearded fellow saying ba, and the video track is him enunciating ga. So let's just look at that. So again, that's incongruent with the auditory. But now when we pair the auditory and visual together,
ba 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 ba.
So that's the exact same audio track as you heard before as ba, but now it's perceived as da because it's paired with that incongruent visual. Now again, this isn't a great video, a great quality stimulus, so if you're studying illusion, you might want to make your own. That's what we did. This is a grad student, a former student in the lab, Audrey Nath. So this is her McGurk stimulus that she made. And some of you might say, boy, that doesn't sound like da, that sounds more like ba, which is the audio track. And in fact, that's not an uncommon percept. If you don't perceive the McGurk fusion percept, you don't get the illusion, and that's what's shown in red here. You just perceive the auditory part of the stimulus. It's kind of like when you're watching a dubbed movie, the lips don't match, you just kind of ignore them and you go with what you're hearing. So these are the two possible percepts, the most common percepts when you perceive one of these McGurk stimuli. So when we tested Audrey's stimulus on a bunch of people, we only got about half of the time people responding with the McGurk fusion percept. That's what this red bar is. In the original Nature paper, they reported that people got it 99% of the time. So that's this green bar here. I've just put question marks here to illustrate that we don't really have any idea what the subjects in that study saw because the stimuli are lost. And we know they saw a ba and a ga paired, but obviously the implication here is that there's probably something different from our stimulus and the stimuli used in that study. That explains this difference. So that's the hypothesis that we're going to test. You can do a meta-analysis. If you look at 23 published experiments, again, there's the original paper. Here's our study. Just a whole range, right? And these stimuli, these studies use a lot of different stimuli. So we tried to test the idea that it was really a stimulus-driven difference that explains these results. So this is a study done by Tabjala Basumalik for her dissertation. So she just collected as many stimuli as she could find by writing to people and combing through literature, and you see they vary a lot. And then she just went and tested all of these stimuli in the same subjects. So we brought 165 subjects into the lab, played these stimuli to them, and asked them what they perceived. And of course, you also throw in control stimuli, congruent bas and gas and das, just to make sure that there's no. And this is also an open choice response experiment that I want to emphasize. So we didn't bias them in any way. We just played them sounds and said, write down what you hear, or tell us what you hear, so or what you think the person is saying. So obviously, demand characteristics. Maybe Harry McGurk was saying, was that da? Was da, wasn't it? So maybe, yeah, sure, whatever you say, buddy. Okay, so here we have the results of this study. As you can see, one of the stimulus was very powerful. It evoked 80%, not as much as the 99% in the original study. But across the rest of the stimuli from these different studies, there was a broad range. So that sort of confirms the hypothesis that different McGurk stimuli do vary in their efficacy. So again, it's not like Kanitsa triangles where you can go to the original Kanitsa paper and just cut and paste his triangles and use exactly the same stimulus he did. Here, everyone's kind of making their own stimulus, and it turns out the stimulus you use makes a big difference. But perhaps even more interesting than that is what happens if you look at the individual subject data. So what I'm showing you here are data from 2 subjects, and each bar represents the results from 10 presentations of one of those 14 stimuli that I showed you. And what you can see in green represents the McGurk percept, red is just that auditory percept, gray is other. This subject, even for the weakest stimulus, he got the McGurk, or she got the McGurk on every trial. And this subject, even for the strongest stimulus, never got the McGurk on any of the 10 trials. So although the stimuli played a big difference, the subject played an even bigger difference. And if we take these results and just collapse across stimuli and say how many total McGurk percepts were there for this person and do that for all 165 subjects, you see the complete range. Some people never got the McGurk, 5 of them, on hundreds of trials. Some people got it on every single trial. And again, open choice, they'd never seen McGurk before, we did the pre-interview. So the only way you can explain this is that there's just tremendous subject-to-subject variability in how we use that visual speech information. These people are using it a lot, these people aren't using it very much at all. And you might say, well, this is just some weird laboratory illusion. Maybe it's just doesn't really matter, but it turns out that any other measure of multisensory speech perception that we've used, like lip reading, speech reading, or speech and noise with visual speech along with it, shows that same dramatic variability. Some people use the visual speech information and some do not. And obviously, it's a great question, what's the source of this individual variability? Again, because this is an important part of human behavior. This isn't some learned thing. You might think this would be innate, as Alfonso was talking about yesterday, and maybe it is, but obviously it ends up in these very different places behaviorally. One thing that we've been focused in on as a potential source of variability is eye movements. You're all familiar with the studies of Yarbus, who shows, and this is sort of the canonical picture, that when people see a face, they look at the eyes and the mouth. But it turns out that different people look at faces very differently. So if I show you a video, and even if it's of someone talking, even if it's not a McGurk video, just someone saying normal congruent syllables, people look in very different places. So this is showing subject 1, and you can see the color bar here just shows where on the screen the person is looking while this video is playing. And this subject is looking at the mouth of the talker. See this red hot spot here? This subject is looking at the right eye of the talker. See the hot spots here? And this is very different patterns. And it turns out these patterns are consistent across time. Chris Baker did a beautiful study where he measured these patterns over a year apart, and they were consistent. So this person would look at the face, at the mouth if you brought them a year back, a year later, this person would look at the eyes. And here's the variability across 32 subjects that we did this experiment on, and just ranked by where they looked. You can see it's a continuous distribution. This person always looks at the eye. This person always looks at the mouth. Some people kind of look at both. Sometimes they look at the eye, sometimes they look at the mouth. This is averaged across many trials, of course. So you can see a very continuous pattern of where people look. And it turns out that this pattern of where you look when you watch a talking face correlates with how often you get the McGurk effect. So if you look at the mouth more, you get the McGurk more. This is the y-axis here. If you prefer to fixate further from the mouth, you get the McGurk less, which kind of makes sense. If you're getting that visual speech information by fixating the mouth, you're using it more, and you don't know which is cause and which is effect, but then you're getting the McGurk effect more. And just to illustrate that visually, if we take the people who get the McGurk a lot and average their fixation pattern, you see it's focused on the mouth. If you take the people who get the McGurk not as much and look at their fixation pattern, you can see it's much more focused on the eyes. So this is a very interesting finding to us, and we're still trying to sort out the implications. When does this develop? Why can you bias people to look one place or the other? Does that affect their perception? So that's the first part of the talk, showing that there's these dramatic inter-individual differences in multisensory speech perception. The results do raise a number of questions, which is, what's the right answer for the McGurk effect? Someone will say, I didn't get the illusion, am I messed up? And you have to say, well, probably not. Maybe it's a good thing. You're not getting fooled by this tricky laboratory thing. But more generally, the question is, when should you put together auditory and visual speech? And the phenomenology of McGurk doesn't really answer that question. So you need to build models of what the ideal observer should do when presented with incongruent speech. And that's what we've been doing. I'm going to tell you today about 2 models, both of which have been developed by my outstanding postdoc, John Magnotti. And the 2 models vary along the spectrum of simple to complex. This NED model, the noisy encoding of disparity model, is very simple, but it has a little less explanatory power. This Kim's model is more complex, but it has a lot more explanatory power. And they're both useful for different things. The R code for both models is available here, and people have been downloading them and using them, so I think they're useful models. And they're both based on this idea of causal inference. And I'll just take a second to unpack that if you haven't heard that before. And this is inference under conditions in which you could have 2 very different scenarios that could have produced the sensory observations. And you've got to make a decision about which it is. And the causal inference judgment that you must make during speech perception is whether the voice that you're hearing comes from the same talker as the mouth movements that you're seeing. And again, there's no magic rule about this. It's just a judgment you always have to make. Again, if you're listening to mom talking, it's the same talker that's making mouth movements and speech sounds. But maybe mom's yawning and dad's talking across the room, I'm going to the store to get diapers. Then you've seen mom's mouth movement, but it's another talker who's making the speech sounds. And under that condition, you shouldn't put together the mouth movements and the speech that you're hearing, because that will mislead you. So this is the causal inference judgment that you have to make. And the most important cue for making this causal inference judgment are the actual mouth shapes and sounds that you hear. We learn through experience what mouth shapes go with what sound. So for instance, an E sound goes with a mouth shape that looks like this. And it's a learned thing. It's learned over many exposures to audiovisual speech. If these match, that's what we call low disparity, and then it means there's one talker. If these are totally different, it means it's high disparity, and they come from two talkers, and then you shouldn't put them together. So this is the fun part of the talk where I show a video of what happens, showing you how it's possible to be misled. So I'm going to show you a video where there's two talkers, but because they match, you make the incorrect inference that it's coming from the same thing. So this is the Avengers here. Let's play this.
Hey, you see my beef jerky?
I did not use it. I might have borrowed it for its flavor.
Listen, man, I didn't step on your dang glow sticks.
Hey, do you get your grandma to lift weights?
She's kind of small.
It sounds like you're disappointed.
'Cause she's disappointing.
Grandmas can't do things like that. You really want her legs to be impressive? I mean, she's basically spaghetti.
All right, so, that goes on. But the point there is that the mouth movements that these actors are making are for different words than the words that you're hearing. But because there's a rough correspondence between them, you're all in. You're like, sure. That's what. That's right. So you can get fooled, and that's what happens in the McGurk effect. You're getting fooled into thinking that there's one talker when really there's two talkers. So how can we model this? Well, the NED model is very simple. We just have these three parameters, which is disparity, the amount of incongruence between the auditory and visual speech cues. That's the stimulus parameter, and then there's two subject parameters. Your disparity threshold, how willing you are to tolerate an incongruence between the auditory and visual speech, and the sensory noise, which is how much variability you have or how accurate you are in estimating that disparity between the auditory and visual speech cues. So I'll just go through that in a little more detail. Going back to the study where we had many different stimuli, you could imagine that these stimuli vary in their disparity. So maybe Audrey's stimulus has a fairly high disparity between auditory and visual speech. Somehow we'll talk about what that means later. And this talker has a lower disparity. And we just plot them along a line of how much disparity there is. Then we have the subject parameter of how much disparity you can tolerate, which is the threshold. So imagine for a subject, it's right here. That means for this stimulus, you're going to say, no, I don't believe they come from the same talker. There's too much disparity. I won't put them together. But for these talkers, you say, yeah, that's reasonable. They could come from the same talker. I will put them together. So you have the subject threshold. Now, the sensory noise parameter, why do we need that? Why aren't these two parameters enough? Well, if you remember back to that data I showed you, for a number of stimuli, sometimes people get the illusion and sometimes they can't. And you cannot explain that with a model where there's just two fixed parameters, because that's all or nothing. So then you have to include a sensory noise parameter, which allows your estimate of the disparity to jitter around a little bit so that on some trials it's above your threshold and on some trials it's below your threshold. And I'll just illustrate that in the next slide. Here's these two subjects. This subject has a higher threshold of what they're willing to tolerate. This subject has a lower threshold. That's what this vertical line means. The dashed line means how much disparity there is in the stimulus. So again, for stimulus 1, there's lots of disparity. For stimulus 9 and 14, there's less disparity. And this broad curve here is how much sensory noise there is. So the stimulus has this amount of disparity in it, but this subject has a ton of sensory noise. So on different trials of the same stimulus, the person doesn't really know what the disparity is very accurately. So sometimes the subject thinks it's here, sometimes the subject thinks it's here. This subject has little sensory noise, so they're very accurate, and so their curve of the estimated disparity is always very tightly mapped to the actual disparity, which again is this dashed white line. And then you just perform that same simple computation I told you before, which is how much of the curve is to the left of the threshold and how much is to the right. So for instance, this subject, even though their threshold is above the actual stimulus disparity, they still get the illusion on a lot of trials because this filled area due to their large sensory noise. Whereas this subject never gets it for that same stimulus because it's always above their threshold. The stimulus disparity is always above their threshold. So they have a much sharper border between getting it and not getting it. This subject has a much more gradual progression from not getting it to getting it as the stimulus gets stronger. So again, that sensory noise parameter is really important in predicting perception. And if we can use this 3-parameter model to predict perception across different stimuli, we could do a great job. RMSE is only about 3 across all 14 stimuli and also across all 165 subjects. Again, the red bar just shows the error between the prediction and the actual behavior of each of these subjects. So with a small parameter model, we can do a great job of fitting the behavior of individuals. And the key thing is this is abstracting away from the actual raw percentage, which is what's been used in all the different studies. And that's really important because we know there's so much subject and stimulus variability that if you just use that raw fusion percentage, it can really mislead you. And a good example of that is in the literature. McGurk is popular in clinical populations, so it's been tried in autistic subjects, and there's actually conflicting results. So Mark Wallace's group has tried McGurk and said, oh, autistic children get it more than typically developing children, and this other group, Julie Irwin's group, said, oh no, typically developing get it more, it's the reverse. Autistic people actually get it less than typically developing. So, right, did one of them do something wrong? No. They just did what you would expect. Each of them made their own stimulus. And all you have to assume to explain these results is that the stimuli that they used were slightly different in strength, which is what we've shown in our results. So again, this black line here shows the stimulus strength. And the second assumption you have to make is that the autistic kids have a lot more sensory noise, which is a pretty reasonable assumption because we know that their sensory systems are not normal. So the orange curve here shows the autistic sensory noise. The blue curve shows the normal sensory noise. And again, the thresholds here we assume are slightly less for ASD than for TD. But for the same stimuli, the autistic children get it, in this case, they get it less. And in this case, they get it more. Because their sensory noise is so much bigger, their estimate of the actual stimulus disparity is much more noisy than the normal controls. So the amount of McGurk that they get differs depending on the strength of the stimulus. So you can explain the results perfectly with this model, and a group in Oldenburg is using the same model to explain how cochlear implant users get the McGurk, because there's also conflicts in the literature for that particular comparison between cochlear implant users and control. So this is a good use of the model because, again, it estimates something about the subject, which is what we really care about, instead of about the stimulus, which is basically just an artifact of how you made the stimulus. So the advantage of this model is it's great for fitting behavior. The cons are that it only predicts makes a alternative force choice between integration and no integration. It doesn't really explain why the McGurk effect happens. Why do you perceive DA when you have this incongruent BA and GA? So to explain that, we have to turn to a more complicated model, but again, one that has more explanatory power. It's got the same basic stimulus parameter and subject parameters as the NED model, but instead of a one-dimensional space, now we're using a two-dimensional space to model audiovisual speech. And on the y-axis, we have visual features, which you could imagine are things like the lip aperture, how far apart the lips are, and the x-axis, which is auditory features, which you can imagine maybe includes the second formant transition. So this is just a spectrogram of these three different syllables, ba, da, and ga, and you can see ba, the F2 starts low and goes high. For da, it starts high and goes low. For ga, it starts higher and goes even lower. So there is a smooth transition along this axis of the second formant, and also on this axis of visual features. How far apart the lips are can obviously vary, but speech is categorical. So in this representational space, even though there's smoothly varying between ba, da, and ga, how far apart the lips are, your brain draws these artificial boundaries, and even if you're just on a little bit on this side of the boundary, you classify a stimulus as a ga or as a da. You don't perceive a mixture of the two. So we're just starting with this simple representational space, but it scales pretty well to an arbitrary combination. There's about 20 or 30 visemes and phonemes, depending on the language. So in theory, you can make this representational space for all of them, but we're just starting with these three. So we've got a representational space, and now we can calculate what the audiovisual percept should be using Bayesian integration. And it's quite simple. Basically, you just take the visual point, and you take the auditory point, and you average the two. And you can hopefully see already what that's going to do. If you have a ba and a ga and you average them, you're just going to end up in the middle in the da region of representational space. But I explained to you before how important causal inference is. If you think there's two talkers, you shouldn't do that. You should just take the auditory percept, because that's more reliable than the visual percept. But it turns out the optimal thing to do isn't to make an either-or judgment between C equals 1 and C equals 2. You should calculate the likelihood of both outcomes using your knowledge from the environment, and then average the C equals 1 and C equals 2 percepts weighted by their likelihood. So that sounds like a lot, but I'll just walk you through it, and hopefully it's not quite as daunting as it seems. Here's another stimulus that we've been using lately. This is a med student, Hillary.
Ba.
Okay, so we have this ba, and you can imagine we might have 3 different stimuli that are just numbered 1, 2, and 3. So you've got an auditory ba here and a visual ga. And I won't go into the details, but the width of these ellipses has to do with the amount of sensory noise in each modality. There's more sensory noise along the modality that you don't have information about. Now, when you average these two together, basically you just take the weighted average by the reliability, and that puts you in this da region of representational space. So according to this prediction, this Bayesian inference prediction, all 3 of these stimuli should end up in the ba region of the representational space. So you should always perceive da. But as I've showed you before, that's not true. You might perceive da half the time, or 2/3 of the time, but 1/3 of the time you perceive ba. And this Bayesian integration model cannot explain that. So now we have to turn to the second step, which is causal inference, and imagine that sometimes people are saying, no, if I don't believe that these come from the same talker, then I should just go with his auditory percept, which is, again, the auditory ba component of the stimulus. Now when you combine these two, again, you take the weighted average. So now it's not the weighted average of auditory and visual. It's the weighted average of this circle, which is the integrated percept, and this circle, which is the auditory-only percept. And when you take that weighted average, that pulls the percept towards ba. And now sometimes you're in the ba region of representational space, and sometimes you're in the da region of representational space. And this predicts that, in fact, sometimes you should perceive da, but sometimes you should perceive ba, which matches the behavior. So with this simple model that includes causal inference, you can explain why sometimes people get the McGurk percept and why they don't. The big advantage of this model, of course, is that it's predictive. We can apply it to other stimuli that it hasn't been trained on. And the simplest possible stimulus is just the inverse McGurk, right? So instead of ba and ga, now I'm going to switch it and have it be auditory ga and visual ba. The interesting thing is that the Bayesian integration model says you should perceive da for that combination, right? Because you have auditory ga now, visual ba, you average them and you end up in this middle region of space, which is da. So you should perceive da all of the time when I just flip the auditory and visual components of the McGurk stimulus. So let's see if that's true. Here's Hillary again. We've just switched it, auditory ga, visual ba.
Ga. Ga.
Now, what most people perceive with that is just ga. They don't get da. They just perceive the auditory component of the stimulus.
Ga.
So again, the behavioral data is just ga, but the Bayesian integration model predicts da, so it fails miserably. Now if we include the causal inference step, the auditory percept is just ga, and it turns out that this integrated percept ends up in a region of space that's different than the real McGurk stimulus, which is down here. And that's a region of space that you never end up in normally, under normal speech conditions. So your brain says, I don't believe that comes from a single talker. I think it comes from 2 talkers. So now I'm going to give this information a lot of weight, and now I end up in the ga region of representational space. And so this causal inference model predicts ga, which is much closer to the actual percept of individuals that we've tested. So just to compare, if you said, well, let's just do a simple Bayesian integration of the auditory and visual modalities, that predicts these results, which matches okay with McGurk, although it doesn't explain the ba percept, but fails completely for inverse McGurk, whereas the Bayesian integration plus causal inference model matches behavior pretty well. So this Kim's model is able to accurately predict perception for arbitrary combinations of auditory and visual syllables, because that's quite powerful, because then you can start feeding in whatever speech stream you have. And the next step in this model is obviously to figure out how we can take the physical stimulus and map it into that representational space, because right now we're just assuming that it has something to do with mouth aperture, but we can't actually measure that right now. And the take-home message is that you can't just have Bayesian integration. You also need this extra step of causal inference, deciding how many talkers are out there in the world. And these two models are good for different things. And again, I encourage anyone who wants to download them and play with them. So now let's talk about speech perception, the neural substrates of it, the neural mechanisms. And this is how I got started on this journey. So this is chronologically out of order, but always makes sense to, what's that? We're doomed to live. It can only make sense if you look backwards, but you're doomed to live life going forward. So I guess that's a good thing about a talk. You can override that briefly. So let's talk about where in the brain all of this cool stuff happens. We didn't get here first. Carl Wernicke figured this out a long time ago, what part of the brain is involved. It's this area of lateral temporal cortex. And in particular, we think it's a part of the superior temporal sulcus and superior temporal gyrus, which I've color-coded in here. And interestingly, some work that we've been doing very recently suggests that there's a pretty sharp boundary between auditory regions, which are shown in green here, this more anterior part of STS and STG, and multisensory regions, shown in purple, the more posterior part. And just to show you where that boundary is, for the anatomy buffs, if we just chop off the temporal lobe and look at it from the top, here's the transverse gyrus of Heschel, HG here. And you can see it's transverse, but it also goes anterior to posterior. So it starts kind of lateral and then meanders back posteriorly. And if you go to that most posterior end of Heschel's gyrus, this is the inflated brain, the folded brain, this is the inflated brain, and just draw a cut there, that's what this red line is, and continue that cut, you just basically sawing the temporal lobe in half there. That boundary seems to matter for the STS. There's actually a big pit in the STS right there, and this Heschel's gyrus landmark seems to be an important role, and that pit might be where some of these auditory and visual neurons start to coexist and put together the information. So I'm not going to go over that data today, but we do have interesting data from intracranial recording where you can have electrodes that are just on either side of this boundary, and you see very sharp differences in their response properties. So it seems to be a fairly sharp transition, like you see almost in ventral temporal cortex, some of the category selective areas there. So, and the average Taylor arc for the Taylor arc buffs is about minus 30 millimeters. Okay, so in these auditory areas, the green regions, these carry a lot of information about auditory speech. So there's very nice studies with fMRI and ECOG showing that you can actually decode what phonemes subjects are listening to by looking at activity in this area. One of the interesting findings from the Mesgarani and Chang paper is actually that when they used ECOG, the electrodes they looked at couldn't tell the difference between ba, da, and ga. They could tell the difference between tha and ba, da, and ga, but ba, da, and ga showed the exact same responses in these electrodes. So that might be one reason why visual information is so important in discriminating these phonemes that are acoustically or otherwise fairly similar. So then we have this audiovisual representation in posterior STS, STG, and there's lots of evidence that this part of the STS is multisensory. It responds to both auditory and visual stimuli. So I'll just go over some of the work that we've done, looking at the hypothesis that this posterior part of STS, STG is the neural substrate for multisensory speech perception, and in particular the McGurk illusion. So the idea is that STS is putting together the auditory information, the visual information to create this fusion percept. So if you can knock it out, that should get rid of the illusion. And the way that we knocked it out was to first scan the subjects with fMRI, because this area does move around quite a bit from subject to subject. The STS is a very variable course, so if you just use skull landmarks, you don't do a very good job of finding it. So we localized it with fMRI and then targeted TMS to that region in each individual subject, and then just played the McGurk stimuli while they were TMS'd and asked them to report their percept. So for this study, obviously, we had to pick subjects who always got the McGurk illusion, because if you never get it anyway, TMSing isn't going to get rid of it. So we found some subjects who always got the illusion, as shown here. Without TMS, they got it 100% of the time, or close to 100%. But when we TMS'd the STS, they only got it about half the time. So it really knocked out their ability to perceive the McGurk effect. Didn't get rid of it entirely, and you can argue about why that is. Maybe we only did one hemisphere and we should have done the other hemisphere at the same time, or maybe we didn't knock out the whole STS, we just knocked out half of it because TMS doesn't get into the sulcus that much. But the key control here is that if we just move the TMS coil a couple centimeters so it was away from STS, they could get the illusion just fine. So it wasn't something to do with the click of the TMS or feeling that little tingle in your scalp. So interfering with activity in the left STS interfered with the McGurk effect, illustrating that there's a causal link between activity there and audiovisual speech perception. And another study we did, we wanted to explore this idea of inter-individual differences. And the prediction here is that the STS might be the neural substrate for these individual differences in the illusion that I told you about before. And just to give you some of the history with that, the idea is that there's data from a lot of studies that show that in this case this is just the auditory part, just the visual stimulus. If you combine auditory and visual, you get an enhanced response in STS. So that's sort of a neural signature of multisensory integration, more activity in the STS because these multisensory neurons are coming online. And you see it with a lot of different stimuli, lots of different studies. So the idea here is that perceivers of the illusion should have more activity in the STS because they are putting together the auditory and visual speech. Non-perceivers should have less activity. So we selected individuals who had a broad range of susceptibility because, again, you don't want just perceivers or just non-perceivers. So the whole range of McGurk percepts here. Then we threw them in the scanner, scanned them. First, we used an independent localizer, so there's no problem with circular statistics. But when we look in that STS region and say, okay, we've localized this STS region, now what happens when you listen to the McGurk stimulus? You can see these green squares here are people who got the illusion a lot. The brown squares are the people who didn't get it, who got it some of the time, and the red squares are people who got it infrequently. You can see there's a much bigger STS response in the perceivers, intermediate perceivers a little bit less, and non-perceivers only about a third as much as the perceivers. So there's a large difference between just the correlation plot shown here, between how much activity you get in the STS and your McGurk percept. So that illustrates, again, we don't know how this relates to eye movement, so that's an important question, the chicken and egg question. Is it that you're looking at the mouth moves, that drives the biological motion neurons in the STS, or is it that you don't like looking at mouths, so you don't make eye movements to the mouth because the STS isn't very active? So we don't understand completely that chain of events, but there's clearly a link between eye movements, STS activity, and McGurk perception. So now the third part of the talk is the more new work still in process, and this is where we're trying to understand what exactly are the computations that we're doing in the STS. It's all well and good to say the STS puts together auditory and visual speech, but how does it do that? And the basic idea is pretty simple. We think that there's small populations of neurons that respond both to the auditory features and the visual features of speech. And so they're able to judge that disparity between the two and decide let's put them together or not, and make an informed estimate about what that combined percept should be. So I showed you before this representational space. These neurons in the STS we think are the neural representation of that space. And we know from previous work, Hoffman and Haxby showed in a beautiful Nature Neuroscience paper that there's parts of the posterior STS that respond to eye movements. Work by Kevin Pelfrey, Udi Zohari, and others have shown that there's a little bit of representation of different body parts within the STS as well, and lateral temporal cortex in general. So some parts like arm movements, some parts like mouth movements. And as I told you before, we know that there's neurons up here that respond to different auditory speech features. But what we don't know about is what's the relationship between those axes of selectivity. So the prediction is fairly simple, as I mentioned. We think that the neurons that like mouth movements, visual mouth movements, should be the same neurons that respond to auditory speech features, because they're the ones that are going to say, yes, that E mouth shape goes with that E sound. They have to learn that correspondence. So to test this idea, we've been showing videos to localize these different regions of the STS. This is work done by Lynn Zhu, a student in the lab, and I'll just show you. She filmed herself and another student. So here's a mouth movement that Lynn's making. Again, just to emphasize, these are silent video clips, so they're not hearing any sounds here. And here's an eye movement. Here's Muge. You can see her making eye movements there. So this allows us to localize mouth movement and eye movement regions. One worry, of course, might be that there's retinotopic differences here. This is down in this part of the face, this is in this part of the face. So we also mask the stimuli. And again, you'll just see the mouth movement there, and then I'll play this video, you'll just see the eyes moving. So then we can present both of these in the center of gaze, so there's not a big retinotopic difference between the eye and mouth movements. So when we look at these activation maps, you can see that we replicate previous findings. So we see that there's eye-preferring regions, typically they're more posterior in STS, and we see these mouth-preferring regions, typically somewhat more anterior, although it's kind of patchy. You know, there's another eye-preferring region that's actually posterior to this mouth-preferring region. So I don't want to make it sound like there's a big, I'm not going to call this the STS eye area and the STS mouth area. It's still not clear to me. how scattered or not this organization is. But for the purposes of our hypothesis, it doesn't matter. Even if the eye and mouth voxels are completely interdigitated, all we're predicting is that the mouth voxels should like sounds more than the eye voxels. It's not the case that they have to be in a big cluster. And it turns out that when we look in these mouth regions and play stories, Aesop's fables, we see a big response to this auditory speech stream. And when we look in the eye voxels, we see almost no response. So there's a very significant difference between the response to auditory short stories in these voxels that are defined purely visually by the response to mouth and eye videos. The second part of the prediction is that these mouth regions shouldn't care about any sounds. So if you hear a bell ringing, that shouldn't have a correspondence with a mouth shape. So then we used Pascal Bélin's TVA visual localizer and compared the response to vocal sounds and non-vocal sounds. And you can see in these mouth voxels, there's a much bigger response to the vocal sounds than the non-vocal sounds. Now, it's not 0 to non-vocal sounds, which is always the case with these category preferring regions, but it's a significant difference. So this fits our hypothesis that there's these groups of neurons or small populations of neurons in PSTS that respond to mouth movements and also respond to auditory stimuli. So they can be the ones that make this judgment and integrate the auditory and visual speech streams. So I just want to conclude by saying, hopefully I've convinced you that there's dramatic inter-individual differences in multisensory speech perception. I didn't have you raise your hands to see who got Audrey's McGurk or not, but that was sort of the genesis for this whole study is that, or this whole line of research is that, you do these demonstrations in class or in the lecture hall, people will be like, I don't get the illusion. This guy's wasting his life studying some crap thing that doesn't work. And you have to say, oh, it's because you're sitting in the back and you can't hear it. But no, you bring them in the lab and you put them right in front of the monitor. They still don't get the illusion. So instead of giving up in disgust, we've turned it into a research program. So another lesson for the trainees out there. So key also is having these models that help make sense of this data. Why should it be that some people get it and some people don't? And I think you can tell a pretty coherent story about why that is if just you make a few simple assumptions that people differ in their tolerance for incongruence and how much sensory noise they have. And finally, I think it's pretty clear that posterior STS and SGG plays a key role in processing multisensory speech, although the jury's still out about what exactly the neural mechanisms underlying those computations are. And I just wanted to finish by acknowledging all the outstanding trainees and collaborators that have made this research possible. Thanks a lot.
It was a terrific talk. What happens if you take the people who look at the eyes and ask them to look at the mouth? What happens?
Yeah, so that's a great question. You think, oh, I'll just tell them to look at the mouth, and then they'll get the illusion. And of course, we tried that, and they didn't.
So why do you think that's the case?
Well, if you're not, say you're just not good at it. I see the mouth moving, but I don't understand I've never learned the correspondence between the E mouth shape and the E sound. Just telling you to look at it doesn't help you get the illusion. So again, if you had intensive training, and we did try that once and it didn't work either, but maybe we did it the wrong way. But if I trained you over thousands of trials to learn E to E correspondence, then told you to look at the mouth, maybe that would work.
Yeah. And the other thing is, are there, we talked about this the other night, are there any differences in sensitivity in the visual field? So that, for example, most often if you're looking at someone, it's going to be in either the fovea or the lower visual field and not in the upper visual field. And I wondered whether or not anyone systematically looked at that. Yeah,
I don't think anyone, again, Kevin Munhall and Martin Prey have done some stimuli where they manipulated the eccentricity of the visual mouth, but I don't think they did the 2x2 of eccentricity versus upper and lower visual field, and I think that would be a really interesting experiment to do.
Do Kevin and Brian?
Hi, that was a very lovely talk. Thank you. I guess my question is, I'll put it in a somewhat provocative way first and then elaborate what I mean. Is this important? So you started out by saying that, multisensory speech perception is important for language learning, although that's culturally specific, infant-directed speech is a culturally specific phenomenon. But even so, you could argue that it's important for learning language or for learning, speech-sound correspondences. But then you showed that there's a big, or at least some subset of normal people who don't get this effect, and presumably then are insensitive to visual auditory integration. But I also presume that those are normal people and they speak just fine and they don't have any problems with language. So I guess the question is, what is this doing for us? Or to put it a different way, do you make any predictions about if you could look back in time at those people who don't get the McGurk effect when they were learning language, would they have been different than the people who do get it?
Yeah, those are great questions. Obviously, you'd like to look at the developmental trajectory. No one's done that. How does McGurk develop? What happens? It's probably the case that at a certain age, no one gets it. That's some hint in the developmental literature that multisensory integration, especially for speech, happens late, maybe 7, 8, 9 years old. So probably if you test a bunch of really young kids, none of them will get it, and some of them learn that and some of them don't. So what's happening developmentally that makes some of them learn it and some don't, and could you interfere with that? That's a great question. The other question is, so what? I think it's certainly provocative, right? And as you get older, you may regret not being able to use visual speech, because as your auditory hearing goes down, that visual speech information becomes more and more important. So you could argue that certainly for older people who don't have that ability to use visual speech, that's going to hurt them.
So I found everything really interesting, but I had I was a little confused by your neurophysiology results, in the sense that coming from the monkey literature, I know a lot about Asif Ghazanfar's work on multisensory processing, and he's seen a lot of integration of auditory and visual in primary A1, and your results suggest that it's all happening much later when it's been passed back to the posterior STS. So do you think this is a change between like the old world monkey and humans, or do you think it's just that it really is critical to the that you're using speech sounds as opposed to he used both faces and voices, but he also used like circles and sounds. So like if you change the circle so it looked like a mouth opening versus not looking like a mouth opening, you wouldn't get the integration, but if you made it look like a mouth, you would get an enhanced response in the cells.
Yeah, obviously that's a great question. The sort of consensus now is that it's not an early or late thing. Multisensory integration is happening all the way along the chain. So there's projections from A1 to V1, so that if you hear a sound over there, you can direct your visual attention to that location really quickly. So you are going to see effects early. Do neurons in A1 have the right properties to put together visual and auditory speech? No, because they don't know anything about visual mouth movements. Are they getting that are they getting information from the visual modality saying, okay, the person's mouth is opening, you're probably going to get a speech sound soon? I would say almost certainly, because you want those auditory filter banks, even in A1, to be ready for when the speech does start coming in. You can prepare them right so that they're ready when the speech arrives. Because again, the key there is the visual information happens a second before the person starts opening their mouth, a half second before the speech sounds come out. So you'd be remiss if you didn't use that preparatory signal to use the auditory signal better. So all we're claiming, I would say that the monkey data supports that. If you stick your electrode in, you find giant groups of multisensory AV neurons in STP in this monkey homologous region to posterior STS, which you don't see in A1. You'll find responses that are modulated by somatosensory or visual stimuli, but you don't find actual evoked responses in those early auditory regions.
Jerry, then Alfonso, then Tom.
Hi, so McGurk effect is just one example of this kind of audiovisual integration, and the causal model made me want to ask whether you've looked at other examples of audiovisual integration. I'm thinking specifically of the work by Krajcik and Samuel, where they find that perceptual learning is blocked when the speaker that you're looking at, for example, has a pencil in their mouth, and if people are hearing an ambiguous segment in the context of a word that drives the interpretation of that segment in one particular direction, having the pencil in the mouth blocks the perceptual retuning that you normally get. And the account there is that there's now a visible cause for distortion to the speech, and that blocks the perceptual learning. And that's an example, to go back to the earlier question, of where this kind of audiovisual integration can actually do some use for you. So I just wonder if you'd sort of applying the model to these other examples. I don't even know if there's the same kind of variability in that kind of paradigm that you're seeing in the McGurk effect, but...
No, that's a great idea. I have not stuck pencils in people's mouths, but we'll definitely start. We'll give that a try. It sounds interesting.
Beautiful talk. I'm afraid to ask this question because it may show me to be an outlier. Why do you get integration? And why not some kind of mixed sound? I did not hear da, I heard ga. My perception, and this one, I'm
for the inverse
question. I may be the last speaker, the last image you showed us, for example. I got this bizarre sound that is not a speech, a syllable or a phoneme in English, and so it is a possible outcome. Why do you get the pure syllable perception and not these mixtures of sounds? And the other thing is that from the ba to ga, the closure of the ba is closed, but the da and ga, in terms of the lip structure, don't look very different. So it's not obvious to me why you get the da sound coming out from ba and ga to this. It's not obvious in terms of a simple feature claim. You could say, well, you have closure and you don't have closure. So the ga should not lead to, da is open like ga. So I'm having some difficulty understanding how this fusion comes about and what are the mechanisms that produce the perception we get.
Yeah, no, so just to answer your second question first, the idea is, of course, that ga and da are visually similar, and that's sort of the point. Your brain is trying to minimize the conflict between the modalities, is one way of thinking of it. And so if you have a ba auditory that's very different than a ga auditory, so your brain says, well, it can't be ba. But again, a ga and a ba are very different visually, so your brain says, well, it can't be ba either. So both of the unisensory percepts are kind of ruled out. But da is in the middle. It's similar visually to ga, and as I showed you in that formant band plot, da is more similar auditorily to ba than ga is. So da kind of minimizes the error, if you will. It's similar to ba auditorily, it's similar to ga visually, so your brain settles on that and says, that's the most likely percept. Again, assuming that it comes from one talker. Given that this auditory and visual information comes from one talker, I can minimize the error by choosing that intermediate da percept. So that sort of is a hand-wavy explanation, which is instantiated quantitatively in the representational space. The other question that you ask about the inverse McGurk, the percept that you got is actually quite common. So this ba-ga percept. So again, that's the auditory ga, the visual ba. And that's obviously something that we don't ever encounter in our everyday life, that sort of percept, where basically there you have the two independent single sensory modality representations, and your brain is just saying, okay, I'm going to give you both of them. And so then you hear the ba part of it first because the visual information comes first. Then you perceive the ga part of the auditory because that comes second, and you get both of them basically sequentially as the sensory information comes in. So that's not very hard to explain either. Basically, you're just saying, I think there's two talkers here, and I can either just go with the auditory, or I can give you the visual and the auditory together and make of them what you will. Does that help at all?
But this is, perhaps it does, but is it like a post hoc explanation, the second one? You hear ga, why don't you hear? Why does the mechanism simply proceed with this, trying to get at the best guess of what it is? Why does it fail to produce an average representation?
Well, it produces a representation. There is a lot of variability. Again, some people do just hear ga. Some people, like you, hear ba-ga. Some people delete the consonant entirely and just report hearing ah. So their brain just says, the heck with that. I'm just going to give you what I'm sure is there, which is ah. I know the ah part. So there's a lot of variability. And again, in these cases where the system kind of fails, then I think it's harder to explain what's going on.
Tom's next, but Kevin, do you want to add something to this?
spaces are not equally continuous, right? So the formant space is more continuous than the lip position space. If something is labial, it can't be not labial. But the formant space is more, there's more continuity.
Great talk. With respect to your model, you showed some data on the autistics, but I'm wondering about there might be a better population in the schizophrenics, because there's the schizophrenic population. There's evidence that there's problems with suppression. There's a lot like the tilt delusion and things like that. So it seems like a suppression mechanism would be very important for suppressing one speaker versus another. And then there's, of course, within the course of their lives, there's unreliable auditory or visual data, depending what type of schizophrenia you have. So it seems like that would be a real treasure.
I see your lips moving, but I hear voices telling me to kill you, Tom. I don't know why, or steal your shirt. But yeah, okay, that's a great question, and there has been studies that look at schizophrenia or McGurk perception in schizophrenia, but they're sort of hamstrung by these same. And again, there's dozens of these studies that look at cultural differences, linguistic differences, age differences, but they're kind of crummy because you don't know how good the stimulus is. And so if they're using a weak stimulus or a strong stimulus, basically you get conflicting results about whether schizophrenics get it more or less. And I think it's probably, again, because they have more sensory noise, not because they have a difference necessarily in their threshold. But yeah, I think with these models, you could do a much better job of characterizing how individuals differ, and then you could look at that relative to, say, their other symptoms and their other sensory disabilities.
I have two questions that are both vaguely on the topic of plasticity in the system. So the first concerns your response to Mel's question about training people by giving them instructions about where to look and showing that even with substantial amounts of training doesn't have an effect. And I was wondering whether you've tried or plan to try other kinds of training things, and if you would be doing so with an eye towards whether this individual difference variable you have here you think predicts how well someone with progressive hearing loss, for example, would be able to use lip reading as an additional cue. So the interest in doing training studies seems to presuppose that there might be some clinically relevant outcome variable. So I guess I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, I'm not a learning training person, so I would love to work with somebody who was better at that sort of plasticity experiment. But I think certainly the idea is that yes, if you could take children or old people who are not using the visual speech information and train them to use it more, if you put them in a condition, say, where there's a noisy environment and the visual speech information is much more important. Again, you get that 10 decibel improvement shown, then that could help them in those noisy speech conditions. And I think that wouldn't surprise me at all. And again, you don't need the McGurk for that. You can just use speech and noise. But I think the key part is learning to use that visual speech information, which people can't seem to do, some people.
And then the second question is motivated by work in perceptual learning in a kind of related domain in teaching adult speakers to or listeners to be able to perceive contrasts that don't exist in their native language. And one of the things that's been found is if you take the acoustically relevant discriminating information, but you take it out of the speech context, so you make it a non-speechy sound, you can train people to make that discrimination, and then they can go back and make the discrimination when it's back in the linguistic context. So it seems like you could do similar kinds of manipulations with these stimuli and see what happens when you take the acoustically relevant information out of the speech signal and see if the phenomenology changes. And I'm just curious if anyone in the 40 years, or I guess 35 years since people have been paying attention to McGurk, has tried that with these kinds of stimuli?
Yeah, no, surprisingly not. I mean, we just finished a study where we slowed down the visual speech, because that was an idea we had. Maybe if, again, like infant-directed speech, if I make the ba really slow, that even people who don't normally use it could start to get it. So sadly, we thought that slowing it down would make people get the McGurk effect more, because they would get the visual speech information. They actually got it less. So, and again, we can talk about why that might be. Maybe the temporal dynamics, the timing is wrong, so we might have to play with the timing. But yeah, certainly I think it's a very fruitful and interesting thing to look at, but no one has done it.
We'll go back to Anna.
Thanks. So I'm wondering if actually your model might highlight an interesting sort of chicken and egg problem in development, going back to the developmental questions that you started with, which is that in order to perform the Bayesian and causal inference that you're describing, you need to have that mapping between the auditory and the visual. But to get that mapping, to learn it in the first place, you might already need to solve that causal problem. And I'm wondering if you've thought about a way to apply your model to the initial phases of learning, whether that might be helpful to understand how we solve that chicken and egg problem.
Yeah, so you take your kid and you raise him in a crowded nightclub so that he never just hears a single talker. Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And you would just have to say that presumably most of the time when mom's talking right up to the baby's face, that voice is predominant. This auditory speech stream and the visual speech stream is the only thing in the visual field. So that gives you those thousands of trials that you need to put together the auditory and visual speech. But it certainly is an important question for this case because you require environmental experience. In the other auditory and visual speech congruence problems, like say the beep flash thing, there's a physical basis for why when the ball hits the ground, you see the ball hit the ground and then you hear the sound because that's physics. But here it's much more indirect, the relationship between the auditory and visual speech. So that's why I think there is so much, and you see less variability in that sort of auditory visual localization, for instance. That's pretty tight across individuals as compared to what we see with audiovisual speech. And it could be, like you're saying, that different children get it or don't get it because maybe they're not learning to make these causal inference judgments.
Mel was next, and then Eileen.
I just wanted to return to the question about visual fields that I asked. And but when people are at different viewing distances, of course, the mouth is going to be much more consistently foveal than it is when the person is very close to you. And moreover, I just wondered whether or not people have looked doing high pass or low pass to find out what kind of visual information is important for the McGurk effect. Have you or others explored that particular domain?
So there's been some nice studies playing with that. Turns out you can low pass filter the image quite a lot. The earlier question talked about the experiments that Asaf did, where you can even replace the mouth with just like a disc opening and closing and still get a little bit of McGurk effect. You can blur the face almost completely. You can chop off the face so people just see the mouth. Because, again, we think mainly you're using pretty simple information like the mouth aperture. You can get that out of a pretty low-pass filtered image. You do get less McGurk. Another cool thing is you can even obscure the mouth entirely, sort of like what I did, but with the disc the oval a little bit smaller. You can actually get information from the cheeks about what the mouth aperture is. So even if you can't see the mouth proper, you can tell what the mouth is doing from the other face musculature. So you can get a little bit of McGurk even with the mouth obscured. So you can do all sorts of tricks, and they all tend to basically decrease the McGurk effect a little bit, but they don't eliminate it even if you make the mouth really peripheral or you blur the heck out of it or what have you.
So that suggests then that the fact that some people look at the eyes and some people look at the mouth is not it's not because habitually the mouth is in the wrong part of the visual field when they're looking at the eye, but rather it's a marker of some other kind of difference between their processing, right?
Yeah, and so we did do that experiment where we forced people to fixate on the eyes, and the McGurk perceivers still could get the McGurk, even though the mouth was in the periphery. So that's exactly right. It's not just that you're not looking there, because you can't get it from the peripheral. It's that you don't care or you don't know what it means. So you're like, I'm going to look at the eyes. And the other thing I didn't talk about is that what are the eye lookers good at? And you can imagine that there's more information about spatial or social cues in the eyes. So maybe there's a double dissociation. And even though the eye lookers don't get the McGurk, they might be better at detecting deception or some other kind of social task.
And if you think of it developmentally, like shared gaze and things like that might be developed better in those kids than ones who look at the mouth when the mother's talking to them.
Did you have something you wanted to add to this point? Yeah. Or? Okay, and then we'll go to Eileen.
Real quick on that, what you guys were just talking about made me think. In the fMRI results, you showed the face, the mouth regions tended to be more activated by voice than the eye movement ones. Have you ever looked at individual differences in that based on the fixation patterns of the subjects? So like, do you see less integration in mouth regions for subjects that tend to look at the eyes?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's some experiments we're doing right now. You have to do eye tracking in the scanner, which is kind of a pain, but again, do people who look at the mouth a lot have more mouth regions of the STS or more activity in those mouth regions? And that's a fascinating question.
I'm just curious whether you think this is something that's kind of special about speech, because speech is so confusing and the space is, so small, you can have such subtle differences for acoustic differences, or whether, any sort of other, I'm just trying to think of an example. Like if I was interested in birds and bird calls and I was looking at, birds that looked similar and their calls were kind of similar, whether I'd see the same kind of phenomenon there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Obviously, as Alfonso talked about yesterday, your brain is set up to process important stuff, and speech is pretty important. So it shouldn't be a big surprise that you have these modules in STS, which are really important for speech, and if you blow them out and you get aphasia, that really messes you up. Now, that said, did these arise de novo? No, they come from macaques that aren't particularly good at communicating lots of vocal information. So you started out with multisensory neurons and you gradually adopted them over evolution to be good at this speech task, but do you also use them to learn associations between the yellow-throated warbler and this call that the warbler makes? Probably, and there's evidence showing that if you learn auditory visual pairings, you see activity in the STS. So I think the answer there is probably yes. Does it do all audiovisual computations? No. If you're doing audiovisual localization, that's done in parietal lobe. People with aphasia are just fine at that. So it's not the general purpose audiovisual association machine in the brain, but I think for complicated things like speech where you have that arbitrary association, you can't do that in the colliculus, unlike spatial stuff. So you do need these neurons that are basically can respond to anything and then learn to pair them up.
Last question to Liuba.
Yes, thanks. I think it's related to the previous question. So I don't understand how we should take the McGurk effect, if it's something special, is a special phenomenon because it relates to language, a language is special, or whether it can be related to what we know about multisensory conflict integration in general, which has been studied with, I don't know, in visuotactile kind of tasks, proprioception, for which we know that there are kind of domain general mechanisms involving right EPJ, anterior cingulate cortex, and so, which you didn't mention. So I'm just wondering whether this is a completely different and special case of multisensory conflict and integration, in fact relates to other instances.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's still sort of an open question. Again, I would say that STS is devoted to this, is specialized for these speech or other really complicated associations between auditory and visual. It does respond to tactile, so that's an interesting question. Why does STS respond to tactile stimuli? And what's the border between the domain general and the domain specific? We don't see a lot of ACC when you give people McGurk. So you might think, oh yeah, it's conflict, you should have sensory conflict, you should kick in to resolve that. It seems like STS is taking care of that resolution for you. And some evidence for that shows, the best evidence that it's domain specific is that you're good at detecting audiovisual disparities. So if I play a flash and a beep and they're 50 milliseconds apart, you have no trouble telling that. But if I shift the auditory and visual speech streams by 50 milliseconds, you are oblivious. You can't tell at all, and you put them together, your STS puts them together, happy as a clam. So that suggests that there is these very different circuits for doing different kinds of auditory visual integration that are specialized for what's needed. So you don't want to be too picky about putting together auditory and visual speech, but maybe when you have something hitting something else, you do want to be picky about that. So that might be why you need to have different circuits so you can be flexible.
Thank you. So we have a 1 hour break now. Poster session B, please come back at 11:15.